When I heard the words "sold" from the speaker of my phone, my brain momentarily refused to accept them, as if trying to reject the reality that was about to collapse on me. My sister, Rachel, sounded smug, satisfied, as if she had just turned the deal of the century, and not deprived me of the last connection with the past, with childhood, with my grandmother. 2,400,000 for this dilapidated beach house. Her voice poured into the phone with mock amusement. Not bad, right, Emma? I gripped my coffee mug so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and only the faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla rising from the drink kept me from throwing it at the wall. The beach house. Grandma's roses, soft pink and cream, curling along the snow-white wooden railing. Home, the heart of my childhood summers, the place where my sister and I built our most cherished memories. You sold it without my knowledge? Without my consent? My voice barely rose above a whisper, but a hurricane was raging inside me. Oh, don't be dramatic, Emma. I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. You didn't use it, you always had too much time with your, so important, legal career in Boston. As the manager of my grandmother's estate, I had every right to make this decision. I forced myself to take a steady breath, remembering the years of judicial practice, but even this experience could not muffle the rage throbbing in my chest. This house belongs to both of us, Rachel. You can't just take it, Anne. Actually, I can, she interrupted me in her smug tone. The documents are final. The new owners will take over next week. I barely held back a curse. And what are you going to do with the money? Oh, I think I'll use my share of a yacht. David always wanted one. Sure. David, her husband, is a gold digger. I have no doubt that he had a hand in this, encouraging Rachel to get rid of the unnecessary inheritance. I could imagine them now, glasses of expensive wine in their hands, laughing in their huge mansion, celebrating how cleverly they had tricked me. It's illegal, I said in a steely voice. I've never signed anything. Rachel snorted. Check your ID, sis. As the executor of the inheritance, I had all the authority. Maybe if you bother to show up at meetings about it, you'd know that. But you've always been too important to family matters, haven't you? It's a painfully familiar manipulation. Rachel was a master of the art of guilt. After my grandmother's death, she raised herself to the rank of a devoted granddaughter, while I, blinded by grief, immersed myself in work, trying to somehow cope with the loss. I should have seen this coming. I will fight. With what? She asked mockingly. With your fancy law degree? Get over it, Emma. You lost. I won. The money has already been transferred. It's all done. Beats. She dropped the call. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, clutching my phone in my hand, feeling anger coursing through my veins, making my heart pound in my chest. Memories came flooding back, my grandmother's laughter on the veranda, the scent of her garden intertwining with the salty sea air, the secret reading table she had built especially for me. The house wasn't just real estate. It was the last piece of her that Rachel ripped out of my life and sold as an unnecessary thing. The phone vibrated in my hand. A message from Rachel. B, who will put your things away by Friday. The new owner plans to take the house. Don't worry, I've already taken everything valuable. I stared at the screen. Something clicked in my head. Everything valuable? Grandma's office. The only room she always kept locked. The one she made me promise to check after she left. I was too wrapped up in business to do that. But now, my fingers were shaking as I dialed the number of the only person who could help. Thomas Harrison, my grandmother's lawyer for over 30 years, answered on the second ring. Emma. I've been waiting for your call. Rachel sold the beach house, I blurted out. She says that she had the right to do this, as the executor of the inheritance. There was a rustle of papers on the other end of the line. Yes, I received the notification this morning. Tell me, have you looked at Grandma's office yet? I froze. No, I said. Why? Thomas paused before answering. Because your grandmother left very specific instructions about this room. And Rachel doesn't know about them. I looked at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Can you meet me this afternoon? A glimmer of hope. All is not lost yet. I can catch the next train to Newport in 2 hours. Perfect. I nodded, even though Thomas couldn't see it, and then I felt my fingertips involuntarily touch the small silver key that hung around my neck. My grandmother gave it to me a few days before her death, insisting that I always wear it, but without explaining why it was so important. Emma, is it ringing? I frowned. What? The key. Have you ever noticed how it rings when you move? I brought it closer to my ear and shook it. A faint metallic sound came from inside. Was the key hollow? Something inside him was rattling, tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was there. How did you do everything on time? I asked, still trying to comprehend the significance of this find. Your grandmother was a careful woman. She knew her granddaughters very well. The 2-hour drive to Newport seemed like an eternity. I tried to focus on the case files in front of me, but my thoughts kept taking me back to my grandmother, to her voice sounding in my head, as if she were here, next to me. You must anticipate, dear, not only the next step, but also the next 5, and always have a contingency plan. When the train stopped, I hurried to the exit. Thomas was waiting for me at the platform, his stern gaze studying my face, as if trying to read what I was feeling. You look just like her, he said softly. Rose would be proud. Rachel wouldn't agree, I muttered, lowering my gaze. She is sure that I left my family for a career. Thomas chuckled. Rachel sees what she wants to see. Your grandmother understood the ambitions. She built her empire out of nothing, after all. But we're not here to discuss Rachel's opinion right now. We're here to discuss your grandmother's opinion. He led me into his office, where he wasted no time taking out a thick folder. Emma, that key you're wearing. Have you ever tried using it? I shook my head. Grandma said that I will understand when the time comes. The time has already come. I tensed up. What do you mean? Your grandmother came to me 2 years ago. She was concerned about Rachel's credentials and her flexible relationship with ethics. So she took precautions. What measures? Thomas handed me the documents. It's the deed Rachel used to sell the property. This is not the final version. 2 weeks before your grandmother died, she filed an amended deed with very specific terms of sale and ownership. And, most interestingly, Rachel, unaware of this, violated the terms. My pulse was racing. What now? Now it all depends on what's in the safe. I frowned. The safe? Your grandmother left clear instructions that only you can open it. And only after Rachel tries to sell the house without your consent. I took a deep breath. Grandma always knew. Thomas looked at his watch. Rachel's at a charity dinner right now. If you want to check the safe, now is the time. The road to the beach house was a muscle memory. I knew every turn, every pothole on the old highway, and even though so much time had passed, it was like those years hadn't happened. When I went inside, the smells of salt, wood, and old books enveloped me. Her grandmother's office remained untouched. Rachel had never been interested in books and business papers. The silver key easily entered the lock of the safe hidden behind the shelf. A click. I opened it and saw a thick envelope. It had my name on it, written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. The note on the cover read, "For Emma. When Rachel shows her true colors." I'm sorry it's come to this, my dear, but some lessons need to be learned the hard way. All my love, Grandma Rosa. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. And with each passing page, the truth became clearer. By the time I got to the final document, I knew exactly why Thomas was so sure. I grabbed the phone, my fingers shaking with excitement as I dialed his number. Did you find him? What is it? He asked without preamble. Yes, I said, clutching the papers so tightly that they almost crumpled. Call Rachel and her lawyer. Urgently. A meeting at your office. Now. There was a tense pause on the other end of the line. And the consequences? What is it? He finally asked. I thought about Rachel's icy voice, her casual betrayal, and the indifference with which she sold off my grandmother's legacy, as if it were unnecessary junk. The house meant nothing to her, but her grandmother's lessons. They always had consequences. Oh, yes, I said, smiling slowly. It's time for Rachel to learn her grandmother's last lesson about thinking ahead. The midday sun filtered through the huge windows of Thomas Harrison's office, casting long shadows on the polished conference table. The documents from my grandmother's safe were spread out in front of me. Every word, every line, every clause of the contract was evidence of her foresight, another layer of protection from what Rachel was trying to pull off. The door swung open as if from a gust of hurricane. Rachel burst inside, wrapped in flowing designer fabric, her heels clattering on the wooden floor, and her brick-red Hermes bag hit the table with annoyance as she dropped it next to her. David followed her in, her constant shadow, with the same smug grin with which he watched my failures. Rachel's lawyer, a young man who was barely 30 and who looked like he was still memorizing the basics of law, nervously toyed with the tip of his tie, casting wary glances at me. I hope this is really important, Emma, Rachel snapped, not bothering to hide her annoyance. I was just planning the yacht club's summer gala. Oh, it's important, I replied in a flat voice. You can sit down. She crossed her arms over her chest, leaning back defiantly. I'll stand. Just say whatever dramatic thing you need to say so that I can get back to my life. Thomas cleared his throat. Rachel, I really think you should sit down. Something in his tone made her hesitate, and after a short pause, she sank into a chair anyway, glancing at David, who stood behind her with his arms folded like a bodyguard. I pushed the document towards her. Let's talk about the sale of the beach house that you just pulled off. Rachel let out an exasperated sigh. We've already discussed this, Emma. As a performer, I continued, ignoring her tone, you were obligated to follow your grandmother's wishes to the letter. All of them, her lawyer interjected, straightening his tie, his voice uncertain, strained. All the relevant documents have been reviewed, and… No, Thomas interrupted him sharply, folding his hands in front of him. Not all of them. He unfolded another document in front of him. Rosa Mitchell filed an amended statement 2 weeks before her death. An act with very specific conditions. Rachel tensed, the corners of her mouth twitching, but she remained impassive. What are the conditions? I held up the page so that the stamp sparkled in the lamplight. The beach house could only be sold with the unanimous consent of both heiresses. You and me. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. That's nonsense. Any unauthorized sale activates the so-called character point. I noticed David's hand squeeze her shoulder sharply. Thomas folded his fingers into a lock and explained in a cold, clear voice. If one granddaughter tries to sell the property without the consent of the other, ownership immediately and irrevocably passes to the injured party. Rachel's nails dug into the surface of the table. It's impossible. I had an act. I had the authority. You had a preliminary report, I corrected calmly. Grandma submitted this amendment because she knew you too well. Rachel glanced at her lawyer. She can't do that. can it?" The young lawyer hurriedly began flipping through the document, his eyes darting over the lines, and his face was getting paler by the second. "It seems," he cleared his throat, swallowing nervously, "this is a legally binding condition." Rachel's face contorted with anger. "But I've already sold the house. The money has been transferred. The papers are signed." Thomas silently unfolded another document in front of her, placing it on top of the others, as if laying out the last trump card in a protracted game, the rules of which Rachel so stubbornly ignored. "The sale is invalid," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "The amended act has priority. The moment you tried to make an unauthorized sale, the house automatically became Emma's property." There was a silence so thick that it seemed as if the air in the room had become heavier. Rachel paled. Her lips twitched, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "No," she whispered, barely audible, but then her voice grew stronger, becoming hoarse, strained. "No. This can't be happening." "Oh, it's only getting worse," I said, leaning forward and sliding my palm across the table. "Because Grandma didn't just write the plan for the beach house. She planned everything." Rachel's eyes darted across the page, picking out individual lines, the meaning of which seemed to slowly sink in. David, who had been looking relaxed until now, glanced at the document over her shoulder, and his smug grin finally disappeared. "The execution of the will," I continued, without taking my eyes off my sister. "It was conditional. As a property manager, you should have followed ethical principles. An attempt to sell joint property without the consent of another heiress is a direct violation." "Effective immediately," Thomas added, his voice professional but firm, leaving no room for discussion. "Rachel, you're resigning from your position as manager. The powers now belong to Emma." Rachel jumped up so abruptly that the chair behind her scraped loudly on the floor. "You can't do this to me." Her voice was trembling with indignation, and panic was blazing in her eyes. "I was doing everything while she was playing lawyer in Boston." I met her gaze calmly. "You tried to steal from me, Rachel," I said, not raising my voice. "You ignored Grandma's wishes and tried to sell our family home for a yacht." David, who had remained silent up to this point, exhaled sharply, his jaw tensing. "What will happen now?" I carefully gathered the documents and put them in a folder in front of me. "Rachel is now handing over all the responsibilities of managing the will," I replied in a flat, businesslike tone. "The sale is cancelled. I will handle the refunds to the buyers. And both of you will vacate Grandma's house within 30 days. A strangled sigh escaped Rachel. Her lawyer looked back at her nervously, clearly anticipating the storm that could break out at any second. "This is our home." She spat, gripping the edge of the table with her fingers. "No," I corrected calmly. "It's part of an estate that you no longer control." David opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas didn't give him a chance. "Rachel had the right to live in the house while she was the property manager," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "But now she no longer holds this position." Rachel slowly sank back into her chair. Her eyes were shining, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were filled with disappointment, anger, and a sense of loss that she couldn't stifle even with her usual arrogance. "Why?" she whispered, not looking at me, but rather addressing the void. "Why did Grandma do this to me?" I silently reached into my briefcase and took out the last item, an envelope sealed with Grandma's wax, with her family monogram on a red sealing wax seal. "She left this for you," I said, rolling it between my fingers before placing it in front of my sister. "You could only open it if the character item is activated." Rachel's hands were shaking as she broke the seal. I knew what it said. There was a copy of the letter for me in my grandmother's safe. "My dear Rachel, if you're reading this letter, it means my worst fears have come true. You allowed your desire for power, status, and wealth to outweigh your sense of right and wrong. You chose betrayal over trust. I love you, my dear girl, but love doesn't mean ignoring wrongdoings. This lesson may seem harsh, but it's one you need to learn. The beach house was never just real estate. He was a symbol of family values. Emma understood that. And you only saw dollar signs in it. True wealth is not measured by yachts, clubs, and expensive outfits. It is measured by honesty and the strength of family ties. Learn a lesson from this. It's not too late to become the person I know you can be. All my love. Rachel clutched the letter in her fist, tears streaming down her cheeks. This is unfair, she gasped, her voice breaking. I was a good granddaughter. I shook my head. No, I said softly, meeting her gaze. You were the granddaughter who played the role. And there is a difference. Her lawyer cleared his throat, his voice restrained but insistent. Miss Henderson, given these circumstances, I strongly recommend full cooperation. But Rachel wasn't listening to him. She whirled on Thomas, anger flashing in her eyes, overshadowing everything else. You knew, she hissed, like a snake trapped in a corner. You knew all this time and allowed me to make the sale? Thomas met Rachel's gaze, and there was no mockery or malice in it, just the unshakable certainty that everything had happened as it should. Your grandmother wanted you to learn this lesson, he said evenly, crossing his fingers in front of him. And some lessons can only be taught through consequences. David snorted, his smug grin returning, but now there was more defiance than confidence in it. This is theft, he said, staring at Thomas. We will fight this. Thomas just shrugged his shoulders slightly, his voice remained soft, almost polite. But be aware that any legal challenge will trigger a full audit of the estate's finances, including some questionable withdrawals. Rachel's face paled, as if all the blood had drained from it at once. She glanced briefly at David, but he had already pulled away, his hand slipping from her shoulder. You have until the end of the month to vacate the house, I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. All property bills should be transferred to me by the end of the week. Rachel swallowed, her lips twitched, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're just going to take everything? I looked at her for a long moment. No. I will manage the property honestly. But you've lost the right to be in charge. She didn't answer, just pursed her lips, then grabbed her bag and almost ran out of the office, her heels tapping on the floor with sharp, jerky anger. David followed her, not even giving any of us a parting glance. Rachel's lawyer lingered, his face expressing a suppressed sense of defeat. I'll send the files tomorrow, he muttered, hiding his gaze, and then added almost sincerely, and I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. When he left, the room was silent for a moment. Thomas sighed, went to the bar and poured 2 glasses of golden liquid. Your grandmother's favorite drink, he said, handing me one of the glasses. You handled it well. Rosa would be proud of you. I accepted the glass, suddenly feeling fatigue settle in my shoulders like a weight that I couldn't get rid of. She knew, didn't she? I muttered, gazing thoughtfully at the slowly rotating amber liqueur. She knew how things would turn out. Thomas nodded, his smile sad. Your grandmother was an exceptional judge of character. I exhaled, thinking about the beach house, the overgrown garden, the memories that were waiting to be restored. I'm going to renovate the house, I finally said. And then, if Rachel lets me, I'll try to fix us. And if she won't let you? Thomas asked quietly. I looked out the window, where the sun was slowly sinking towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the colors that Grandma loved the most. I will fulfill her wishes anyway. That evening, I parked at the beach house, sitting in the car and watching the last rays of the sun reflected in the waves, enveloping everything in a soft golden light. The phone vibrated in the passenger seat. I took it, not surprised to see a message from Rachel. I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything. I looked back at the house. Grandma's house. Our house. The future slowly unfolded in front of me, like a sunset sky, in which thousands of shades of the future were hidden. I held the phone in my palm and whispered, "No, Rachel. I didn't mess up anything. I saved it." The next few weeks passed like a whirlwind as I sorted through the years of paperwork that had accumulated in my grandmother's main house. The deeper I delved into the financial statements, the clearer the true picture of how Rachel managed the estate became. The full extent of her mismanagement was painfully obvious. The inheritance funds have paid for everything from luxury spa vacations in Italy to crazy designer purchases, all neatly disguised as property maintenance or administrative expenses. One evening, I was sitting at my grandmother's antique desk, surrounded by bank statements and receipts, when the phone rang. I picked up the phone without looking at the screen. Emma, Thomas's voice was businesslike, without preamble. Rachel's lawyer just informed me that she requires an official audit of the property. I froze, and then I couldn't help but laugh. Does she really not understand that the audit will reveal all her unauthorized expenses? I have a hunch that David is behind this, Thomas replied thoughtfully. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. And what are they complaining about? About unfair treatment. David claims that you plotted against them at the country club. I snorted loudly. Of course he thinks so. How do we deal with this? Thomas asked, and I heard a strange note of amusement in his voice. I narrowed my eyes. Something tells me you already have an idea. Oh, and more than one. Thomas paused, then added, Your grandmother kept meticulous notes. All legitimate expenses were documented, and every asset was accounted for. Rachel's creative accounting won't stand up to any scrutiny. Just at that moment, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the office window, I saw Rachel's white Mercedes turn onto the ring road and brake hard at the front entrance. I'll call you back, I told Thomas, getting to my feet and putting the phone on the table. My sister is here. Rachel didn't wait for an invitation. The door swung open, and she walked inside with the same confidence she'd had all her life, as if nothing had changed, as if she still owned the place. Her heels clicked aggressively on the old wooden floors, each step echoing muted in my temples. We need to talk, she announced, appearing in the doorway of the office, her voice firm but with a slight note of tension. I silently pointed to the chair in front of me. I'm listening. She remained standing with her arms crossed over her chest, her posture tense, and her lips pressed into a thin line. This has gone far enough, Emma, her voice cracked with suppressed irritation. You've expressed your point of view, but this is ridiculous. I'm a family member, not an employee. You can't just fire me. I tilted my head to the side, watching her intently. No one's firing you, Rachel, I replied calmly. But actions have consequences. Did you try to sell the beach house without my consent, use the inheritance funds for personal expenses, and now you're surprised that you've lost the right to dispose of the property? She jerked her head up, her eyes flashing with anger. I was the manager, she snapped. I had every right to compensation for my time. I slowly reached for the stack of papers on the table and spread them out in front of her. Compensation is one thing, I said, but turning an inheritance into a personal ATM is quite another. I turned over the top sheet. Designer bags. Next one. Spa holidays. Another one. David's membership in the golf club. I looked up at her. It's not a property expense, Rachel. She pursed her lips and finally sat down on a chair, her self-confidence wavering. What do you want from me? What is it? She asked wearily. I folded my hands in front of me and paused before answering. I want you to take responsibility. Give me back what you took. You're not in charge anymore, but maybe, just maybe, we can save something. Rachel laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Return it? With what money, Emma? There was a note of doom in her voice. David's real estate business is falling apart. The country club has raised dues again. And now you're kicking us out of this house. We can barely afford the mortgage as it is. I couldn't help but frown. For the first time in many years, I really looked at my sister, not as an enemy, but as a person. Behind the designer clothes, the carefully applied makeup, and the artificial confidence, there was something else. Despair. What happened to you, Ratch? I asked quietly. When did propriety become more important than anything else? Her lips twitched. You don't understand, she whispered. You left. You built your perfect little career in Boston, and I stayed here trying to save our family's position. Do you know how hard it is? How expensive is it? I shook my head. No one asked you to do that. Grandma definitely didn't ask for it. She cared about family, about honesty, not about social status. Rachel gritted her teeth. That's easy for you to say, Emma. You've never cared what people think of you. I exhaled slowly, holding back my irritation. Because Grandma taught us that it shouldn't matter. Rachel turned away, her shoulders shaking. I took a deep breath. Listen, I said, choosing my words. I'll make a deal with you. She turned slowly to me, and there was something like hope in her eyes, but it was disguised as disbelief. Which one? Return the inheritance funds that you misused. Help me rebuild the beach house instead of trying to sell it. If you agree, you can stay here until you and David get back on your feet. She jerked her head up, her eyes widening. Are you serious? You're still my sister, Rachel. And I think that's exactly what Grandma would like, to give you a chance to fix everything. There was silence in the room. Rachel was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the portrait of her grandmother above the fireplace. I could see emotions fighting in her eyes, anger, bitterness, confusion. Finally, she sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. The beach house needs a new roof, she muttered, not looking at me. And the garden is in complete disrepair. I nodded, leaning forward. I know. But we can fix it together. If you want. Rachel hesitated, as if internally struggling with a decision that might have been brewing for a long time. Then she reached into her designer bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table in front of me. These are the estimates I received, she said, avoiding my gaze. Before I tried to sell the house. I thought they would help raise the selling price after the renovation. I took the folder, ran my eyes over the numbers, seeing in this simple gesture something more than just the papers handed over. It was an olive branch, an attempt at reconciliation, the first step towards making a difference. Thank you, I said, looking up at her. This is a good start. Rachel pressed her lips together, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, then said softly, I'll talk to David about the money. It may take some time. We can work out a payment plan, I assured her. That's what the family does. When she stopped at the door, I already thought that the conversation was over, but she turned around, and there was something new in her eyes, not just regret, but perhaps sincere remorse. Emma. I'm sorry. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak further, and then exhaled. Not just because of the beach house. About everything. I got lost somewhere along the way. I nodded, letting the words settle in the air between us. I know, Ratch. I paused before adding. But we can find our way back. Grandma always believed in second chances. And me too. When she left, I immediately called Thomas to update him on the payment plan. "Are you sure about this?" "What is it?" he asked doubtfully. "No," I said honestly. "But I have to try. At least for Grandma's sake." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Thomas sighed. "Well, your grandmother believed in redemption," he mused. "Almost as much as she believed in the consequences. Just be careful, Emma. People don't change overnight." I knew he was right. I wasn't going to let go of the reins, but maybe this situation could lead us to something better. The next morning, I arrived at the beach house early, expecting to be greeted only by silence, but to my surprise, Rachel's car was already parked in the driveway. I found her in the garden. She was wearing jeans and work gloves, pulling weeds out of overgrown bushes, and the sight momentarily stunned me. I haven't seen my sister like this since I was a kid. She raised her head as I got closer. "Roses," she said, pointing to the tangled branches and weeds. "Grandma's prize roses. They're still alive under that stuff. They just need care." I knelt down next to her, put on my gloves, and reached out to the bushes. "Show me what to do." We worked side by side in the morning sun, and as I plucked dry leaves and dead branches, I thought about my grandmother's letter, how she said that lessons sometimes have to be learned the hard way. Maybe this was also part of her plan, not only the consequences, but also the chance for reconciliation. Rachel suddenly froze, dropping her hands into her lap, and then said softly, "Emma, I need to tell you something." I felt something constrict inside, a premonition squeezed my chest. "About what?" She stared at the ground for a long time, as if hesitating to speak, then took a deep breath. "About other property-related issues." I froze abruptly, my heart beating faster. "What other questions?" Rachel swallowed, then clenched her hands into fists, as if gathering her courage. "I invested some of the money from the inheritance." She said it almost soundlessly, but I heard every word anyway. "What?" David said. She took a shuddering breath, that he had an amazing opportunity. "Of course he said that." I closed my eyes, already knowing what I was going to hear next. "How much?" She hesitated, then whispered, 800,000. I felt like everything inside of me was squeezed, as if from a blow. 800,000? My voice cracked. From my grandmother's investment accounts. I jerked upright, staring at her in mute shock. This sum hit me like a physical blow, knocking the ground out from under my feet. "You didn't invest it in one of his real estate schemes?" My voice became dangerously flat. Rachel was silent. But her silence was enough of an answer. I thought about my grandmother. About how carefully she built her fortune, how thoughtfully she distributed finances, how she planned our future so that we would never need anything. And now $800,000 are gone. All the efforts, all the foresight, everything she did for us ended up in David's hands. I exhaled slowly, but I couldn't find the words. She looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "But guilt won't give us that money back." Now my grandmother's hard work, years of prudent planning and wise investments turned out to be connected with some dubious enterprise that David had come up with, and I felt anger boiling inside me, cold, controlled, but still destructive. "What exactly did he invest in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my fingers were already clenching into fists. Rachel swallowed, still not looking at me. "A building project in Florida. He said it was a guaranteed income." She nervously turned over her work gloves in her hands, as if this gesture could somehow reduce the severity of her words. "But?" I knew there was a "but" in this story, and judging by her expression, it was disastrous. The developer filed for bankruptcy last month. And here it is, the real reason for their desperate attempt to sell the beach house, the reason for David's aggressive reaction to the threat of an audit. They weren't just living beyond their means, they were trying to hide a huge financial disaster. I slowly took out my phone, already dialing Thomas's number, but suddenly I felt Rachel's fingers squeeze my wrist. "Please," she said pleadingly. "Don't call him." "While." I looked at her sharply. There was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "David doesn't know I told you that. He thinks we can still fix it somehow." I almost laughed. A harsh, bitter laugh rose in my throat, but I suppressed it. "Fix it?" I asked in an icy voice. "Rachel, it's not just a mistake, it's a theft. You took protected real estate funds and lost them in a bad investment. This is not something that can be fixed." She covered her face with her hands, and when she spoke, her voice cracked. "I know." And this time, it wasn't part of her usual calculating behavior. She really broke down. "I know I've ruined everything," she whispered, sobbing. "Everything is falling apart, and I do not know what to do." I stared at her for a long time, and for the first time in a long time, I saw not an arrogant, confident Rachel who always did what she thought was right, but a woman who was scared, lost, desperately clinging to the illusion of control that had long eluded her. Maybe that's what Grandma saw. A woman who was so desperate to prove her worth that she ended up losing sight of what really mattered. I stood up, struggling through anger, frustration, and pain. "First of all," I said, "we need to understand exactly what happened." I tossed her the car keys. "Let's go to David." The trip to their home in Providence was stressful. Rachel opened her mouth several times, as if she was going to say something, but then changed her mind, just clenching her fingers in her lap. When we arrived, his Range Rover was already parked in the driveway, as if confirming that he hadn't gone anywhere, which meant we wouldn't have to look for him. "Let me do the talking," I said before we headed for the door. When David opened the door to us, his face was contorted with suspicion and annoyance, but there was more to it than that, tension bordering on panic. "Rachel, what did you do?" "What she was supposed to do a few months ago," I replied coldly, pushing my way inside without waiting for an invitation. The foyer of their house was as immaculate as ever, with expensive furniture, perfectly placed paintings, and immaculate order, but now I saw that it was just a facade hiding emptiness. "Start talking, David," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "What happened to this project in Florida?" What emerged over the next 2 hours turned out to be a story of increasingly desperate financial decisions. David used his house as collateral to invest money in the project, confident that this deal would solve all their problems, that they would start making fabulous profits from the first few months, but when the developer went bankrupt, their debts began to snowball, and then he put pressure on Rachel, convincing her to use the funds. Inheritances to cover their growing financial obligations. "This shouldn't have happened," he insisted, nervously pacing the living room. "The key word is should have," I said, flipping through the documents he had reluctantly provided. "Did you at least check before investing?" There was a tense pause. His silence was the answer. I turned to Rachel. She was sitting on the edge of their expensive leather couch, small, depressed, broken. "That's why you tried to sell the beach house," I said, and it wasn't a question anymore. "You didn't want to get rid of the past. You tried to cover up this mess before anyone found out." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "The developer demanded more capital," she muttered, unconsciously tugging at the edge of her sleeve. "David said that if we cannot provide it, we will lose everything that we have already invested." I looked at David. He met my gaze, which was filled with fear, but not remorse. "You knew you were losing money, and you went on anyway, dragging Rachel into it by using her access to the family's finances, and now you both have nothing but debts and broken promises." He didn't answer. Rachel covered her face with her hands. I looked at David again. "You knew it was illegal." "It was risky," he said. "But if everything had turned out differently." "But it didn't work out." There was silence. My sister was trembling. The husband for whom she betrayed me shrugged his shoulders, as if he still hoped that this could be fixed somehow. But I knew it wasn't. I panicked. Grandma's words rang over and over in my head. You have to anticipate not only the next step, but also the next 5. She knew. She always knew. Rachel, her receptivity to David's promises, his financial recklessness, the inevitable collapse, she had foreseen all of this. But could she have left us a way out? My phone rang again. This time I didn't hesitate and answered immediately. Emma, Thomas's voice was strained. We urgently need to talk about the situation in Florida. I sat up straight, gripping the phone tighter. What did you find out? Your grandmother. He hesitated for a moment, then continued, left very specific instructions in case of unauthorized investments, including a separate insurance policy designed specifically to protect property from such situations. I froze. What kind of policy? Pretty substantial, Thomas explained. She knew that Rachel might be tempted to invest unwisely from her inheritance. The policy covers losses of up to $1 million, but only in cases of unauthorized investments or misappropriation. I closed my eyes, stunned by yet another example of Grandma's foresight. Can you come to David and Rachel's house? We need to deal with this now. An hour later, we were all sitting at their dining table, me, Rachel, David, and Thomas, who had a thick folder of documents spread out in front of him. The insurance claim will cover the lost investments, Thomas explained, but there are conditions. Of course there is, David muttered, leaning back and crossing his arms over his chest. Thomas ignored him. First, he continued, both Rachel and David must sign an agreement acknowledging their responsibility for unauthorized investments. Rachel cringed, but nodded. Secondly, they need to undergo financial management consultations. He turned to Rachel, and the property will cover these expenses. And thirdly? I asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Thomas looked at David and spoke with particular clarity. David must formally and permanently renounce any involvement in the property. There was silence. And if we refuse? David narrowed his eyes, his voice challenging. Then Emma will have no choice but to sue for the return of the misappropriated funds, Thomas replied without a shadow of doubt. Given the available documentation, this is likely to lead to criminal charges. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath. I saw her reach for David's hand, but he abruptly pulled away and stood up. I need some fresh air, he said, and went to the front door. Rachel watched him go, then turned to me, tears glistening in her eyes. What is happening now? Her voice was thin, almost childlike. I looked at her with sympathy. We're doing what Grandma would like, I said softly. We fix what's broken. Not only the beach house, but also our family. But it will only work if you are really ready to change. She was silent for a long time, then nodded slowly. Consultations. Will you come with me? Not because I have to, but because we're sisters. Yes, I finished. Over the next few months, a new pattern of behavior developed. Rachel and I spent the weekend at the beach house, slowly restoring it to life. She took up gardening with amazing energy, and I could see how her hands, once accustomed only to credit cards and champagne glasses, were now confidently wielding a pruner and a hoe. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of the girl I remembered from childhood, before status and appearance became important to her. In the fall, David filed for divorce. Rachel was devastated, but not surprised. He never loved me, she confessed one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the last warm breeze stir the leaves of the restored garden. He loved what I imagined. Access to Grandma's money, social connections. When it all fell apart, he lost interest in me. His loss, I said firmly. Rachel smiled faintly, but her eyes were sad. The insurance claim protected the property, but more importantly, Rachel began to change. She continued to attend financial counseling, learned how to manage her money, and even got a part-time job at a local garden center, discovering a real talent for landscaping. A year later, we held a small ceremony in the restored garden dedicated to Grandma. A bench made of white wood stood under a canopy of blooming roses, and a simple inscription was engraved next to it. For Rose. Family is our roots that always lead us home. Rachel spoke, her voice steady and clear, and the new confidence was reflected in her eyes. I know that Grandma would be proud not only that we restored the beach house, but also that we finally found our way back to what really matters: